The silence is almost deafening when it comes to the two Michaels. Of course, they're home. Everyone is grateful for it. I hope that they have been healing and re-entering their families and rethinking their lives, and perhaps spending a little time thinking about what their government was able or unable to do for them. This is a very, very serious issue. Hostage diplomacy that works sets a dangerous precedent in the world. Today, we're going to take a look at all of the issues, what the American role was, what our allies are thinking about our embrace of China, what it means for defense of the Five Eyes, our actual partners. We have a guest with us today who is just going to be able to take us over that minefield in a very powerful way. Christian Leuprecht, he is a professor in leadership. I'm just going to go through the list so you know. Director, Institute of Intergovernmental Relations at the School of Policy Studies at Queen's University in Kingston. A new task that he's taken on recently, editor-in-chief of the Canadian Military Journal and the Canadian Defense Academy Press. He is also a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and has recently written a new book entitled, and I won't give you the long title, but Intelligence as Democratic Statecraft, looking at the need for accountability across the Five Eyes countries. So a lot to cover today. Christian, thank you so much for being with us.
It's my sincere pleasure to be here. Thank you.
It's great. Let us start, if we just can, with the two Michaels. And I'm glad that they have just been able to go home and go to ground. There was a nice little tweet out earlier today of a bird coming out of a cage put out by one of the Michaels, but they will have this time with family. How on earth did we let it ever get that far?
Well, I mean, and there's the human tragedy, right? If you're locked up for 1,000 days unjustly, as clearly their release demonstrates, the personal damage that they will take away with them for the rest of their lives, because of the diplomatic issues and I think the challenges that we had in trying to prepare for the situation, anticipate it, and being able to tackle it in a more forceful fashion. I think that for me is the biggest tragedy, the human tragedy. And we got to learn from what happened here. We got to make sure that this does not happen again. And it doesn't happen again, not just to our own citizens, but of course, the citizens of other countries that find themselves in the same situation, because we're not alone. Australia, Japan, India, that all have citizens in similar situations. And that's why it was important to demonstrate that hostage diplomacy was not going to succeed, that it was important to demonstrate that there was not going to be a prisoner swap. And I actually interpret what happened as a win for the rule of law and as a win for the government, to some extent, having played the long game here. That is to say, we let our proper processes play out. And I think as it became more clear that those were not going the way that necessarily Ms. Meng wanted them to go, but that also there was some uncertainty on the US side, we capitalized on diplomacy and we managed to finally free the two Michaels. But
unless the Americans had decided that they just wanted to resolve this and get the Meng issue out of the way for them, everything that was done in terms of their request for an extradition and for our holding Miss Meng, that's all according to law. That's nothing. Nobody did anything wrong there. But we couldn't seem to get anybody's attention to help us. And this with one of the most powerful, or at least connected, ambassadors, Dominic Barton, in China, that any country has there.
Yeah, so I think ultimately Canada got caught in the middle between two superpowers, and or between sort of a superpower and shall we say a rising an
aspiring superpower, yes,
and well, an aspiring power that is looking not just to revise the global system, but to overturn the global order. That's, of course, an important part of this conversation, that we're dealing not just with any one country that might have tried to take Canadians hostage, that we're dealing with a country that is fundamentally bent on changing the way the rules for the international system are, the way we've built them and the way we've gotten used to them since the end of the Second World War. And I think that's an important part, of course, of this conversation. But I think what also happened here is that the US authorities doubled down on the opportunity to get a deferred prosecution agreement. So it's not like Ms. Meng was able to walk free. I think
I get it, right.
So, and I think that, of course, is a key part of this of the deal here, that there was an admission of wrongdoing. And I think that was ultimately what it was about, because now we can pursue the broader strategic interest of actually holding Huawei to account for its egregious abuses in terms of the way it does business, in terms of the way it abuses human rights on a global scale, the way it enables authoritarian regimes. And I think this is sort of a bigger win here. Plus, I think also the message that the Americans had always tried to send here, that Chinese corporations and Chinese executives will no longer get away with impunity and simply flouting laws and flouting sanctions, that there are basic rules, norms, morals by which you do business. And if you break those, you will be held to account. And I think that is really the broader message, I think, that is being received.
I'm glad you're so optimistic about that, because the flip side of that coin, Christian, is that hostage diplomacy worked. They forced the Americans into action. I'm just turning the vantage point here. They forced the Americans into action. Yes, she had to admit guilt. Probably nothing will ever happen of it. But we conceded for more than 1,000 days that we couldn't do a damn thing about the two Michaels.
Yeah, and I think, as you know, like I'm on record before in the media, before a parliamentary committee, in op-eds, that the policy approach here is that we don't have an approach. That on the one hand, there would have been an opportunity to be to be tougher. But look, I mean, look at what is our China strategy. Sort of this sort of, on some things we're a peer, on some things we're a competitor, and on some things China is an adversary. That's not a strategy. That's sort of the typical Canadian. We're just kind of muddle through. There's no sense of what the end game is. Not on this policy file, and pick any other policy file. Where do we want to be as a country in 10 or 20 years from now with an adversary that's looking to overturn the international order? This is an existential question for Canada. For Canada, its allies and its partners. If we believe in the democracy that we all cherish, the prosperity and the security that we cherish, this is a country that is intent on upending all of those. And so simply muddling through is clearly not an option. And I think that's my takeaway for me, that yes, we needed to be tougher. We had the opportunity to be tougher. There's 4% of our exports that sort of hinge on China. We're not like Germany, where half of our economy depends on something like this. And so, you know, and I think we also didn't have some of our allies' backs. So when we were disappointed that the two Michaels,
a tougher stand than us.
Right. So we expected our allies in the Indo-Pacific to stand up for us and to stand with us in front of the courthouse, for instance, when one of them was being tried unjustly. And then we were disappointed when our regional allies basically didn't show up. And yet, of course, what is it that we're bringing to the Indo-Pacific? You know, there's two that need to play at this game. Canada, especially when it comes to the Asia-Pacific region, you know, I sometimes feel like we're missing in action. Our ministers are missing in action for regional meetings. We're missing in action in terms of supporting our own allies when they're facing their security challenges in the region, when they're being hard pressed by China. But then, of course, being the good, smug Canadians that we are, the moment something happens to our citizens, we expect everybody else to stand up for us. And so I think reciprocity is an important part of this.
Right. This is, I mean, this, and maybe I'm being unfair here, but I don't think so. So we know what Father Trudeau's position was, and he traveled and went through China and embraced that system in that quite, curious, but also paternalistic way, which is, we are going to engage with China and we're going to bring them into the modern era and we're going to do all of that. That was, 40 years ago. My sense is that our current prime minister has an affinity for China. He's, of course, in some situations said you can get a lot more done, obviously, if you're an authoritarian regime. there's an awful lot of business interests and supporters of his that are invested in China. So can we have a policy? How do we work around that personal mindset, which perhaps does not reflect the reality of today and China's intention? Would a decision on Huawei be a first step? Would a decision on the Olympics to stay at home be a step? Like, how do we launch a new approach and a more sophisticated approach to this question?
So I think we need to demonstrate at least that all these options are in play. When the other side plays completely in contravention of international law, the international rules, and the way you behave as a mature country in the international system, Canada needs to demonstrate both on its own and with its allies that all these options are in play. And Australia has put all these options in play. And look, you might argue that Australia is actually winning on that as the smaller of the two, that China has currently suspended essentially its tensions with Australia because it desperately needs Australian coal imports in order to keep the lights on. We all know that the lights have been going out in China. And so, I think we buy into this narrative that China is somehow 10 foot tall and that China is this all-powerful somehow country. And that's, of course, exactly the spin that the Chinese authorities are trying to put on. So I think the first thing we need to do as Canada is to cut them down to size and to make sure that people understand, no, China is not 10 foot tall. We're not buying this narrative that somehow China is sort of all powerful, that China is an extremely vulnerable country on many fronts, and that we can demonstrate that we understand those vulnerabilities. And that if China is going to be reliant, for instance, on 5 countries, including Canada, for the bulk of its food imports and its food staples, that we expect certain reciprocity in terms of treatment for our own companies, for our own citizens when it comes to China. And I think that's really what much of the conversation comes down to, that China does not operate on the premises of reciprocity. And I think that was one of the 2 big mistakes of the last 25 years was admitting China to the World Trade Organization, of not anticipating that
and
you
giving
can
them a
deal with
veto.
an authoritarian regime.
And giving them a veto at the WTO as well, which is just absurd. All right, we're on that topic. Let's just go there. So what the new US president said when he was elected was, we are going to have a top to bottom review of our Canada or of our US China policy. And there is in fact no evidence that he is getting tough over the theft of technology or intellectual property or any of those things. Some of the critics have called it Trump light, which is just, you kind of fight each battle and that's it. What do we need to see from them to start to push back to China to, in fact, tell them they're not 10 feet tall?
So I think there's at least 3 elements that need to be in play here. The first is that the US has been distracted by theaters in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Imagine if those resources had instead over the last 20 years been invested in the Indo-Pacific to anticipate how China was going to act and to contain China, how much further ahead we would be on this conversation. And so I think the silver lining on what transpired in Afghanistan is that finally the US can focus on invest its resources and its bandwidth. I think the next challenge is that we need to give the US some breathing room. And this is where Canada, I think, plays an important role. We need to give the US the bandwidth it needs to focus on the Indo-Pacific. This is why Canada needs to do more, for instance, when it comes to Europe and European security, why Canada's support for NATO missions along the entire European and Mediterranean periphery is so important, so that we can signal to the Americans that we're going to do our part because we need you to focus on the Indo-Pacific, and arguably what's a Canadian frigate or so really going to make in terms of a difference in that area other than reassert sort of our rights to international navigation. And I think we can do a lot more by having a better division of labor and signaling that we're prepared to do our part. That, of course, requires an investment in defense. It requires to have the resources, to have the capabilities. Precisely that if the Americans are going to shift their attention to the Indo-Pacific, that there remains a credible deterrent for Russia and for other bad actors in the region with our resources there. And the third is, I think, the Americans have had a challenge on domain awareness when it comes to China. And you can see this on a couple of files. You can see on how divided the intelligence community was, especially initially, on the virus's origins and how to deal with the virus. And you can see it by the CIA's announcement just in recent days that it is going to have a dedicated center and cell simply to collecting any and all intelligence on China. Now, it is stunning that an organization like the CIA has not had a clearinghouse for all intelligence on China to begin with. But of course, if we're going to expect leadership from our most important and most powerful ally, we need that ally to have full domain awareness. We also need that ally, of course, to have the full cooperation from allies and partners, in particular across the Five Eyes intelligence community. And so that's why it's important that if, on the one hand, the Americans are going to focus more on China, we need to support that focus, but we also need to be able to, their resources are limited too. So it means that Canada and other Five Eyes countries are going to have to do more in perhaps other parts of the world so that the Americans can really focus their resources. And again, I think here we can be a better player and a better ally by ensuring that we can support the Americans with the newfound direction that they have. But I think the administration is struggling as to what its strategy is going to be. And it's the same problem. There's no end game. There's no clear end of what the Americans want to accomplish when it comes to China in 5, 10, 20 years, and how they're going to get there. And that's, I think, we didn't really see much of a strategy from the Trump administration, and we don't have much of a strategy from the Biden administration. Simply pushing back on China is in and of itself not a strategy if we don't know what is the end game that we're after.
Okay, so I agree totally on the big picture, but let's just deal with a couple of issues. So the exit and withdrawal from Afghanistan was nothing short of a disaster led by the Americans, costing many, many lives and leaving friends and genuine allies, people who walked alongside our soldiers on the ground, in trouble and to an unknown fate, and in many cases, death. China wants access to Afghanistan because it has rare earth minerals and it's close and they can do it. And if they're going to continue their high tech. So, and we're a party to all of that. Canada, has given a contract to a Chinese company to do all the security infrastructure at all our embassies and consulates around the world. And we haven't made a decision on Huawei. I'm sorry, that is sending the message that it's business as usual.
So, yeah, so of course, I mean, if you read my piece in Inside Policy on Afghanistan, I mean, General Miller had an exit strategy. You pull out your citizens, then you pull out your equipment, then you pull out your troops. And for political reasons, the Biden administration did the exact opposite. They pulled out the troops first and they left the equipment and the citizens behind because the president wanted to stand up on 9/11 and say, mission accomplished, after 20 years, our troops are out. So it's the problem of when we don't listen to the advice that we get from the experts. And of course, the debate that we could have had about, 2,500 troops could have probably maintained the status quo.
Exactly.
Was it worth staying or not? We could have certainly averted the disaster that it was. But the real challenge here isn't the calamity, this sort of approach of that, better an end with horror than horror without end. But the sense of that, the way it has undermined the perception of US commitment to allies and partners.
Exactly.
And of course, deterrence by the United States and international security, international stability hinges on the US ability to deliver on capability and commitment and being able to signal that commitment. And what Afghanistan did was fundamentally undermine the ability to signal that commitment. And that has broader ramifications. It means that it emboldens countries such as China that are now sending striker packs towards Taiwan because we've probably emboldened China to think that, will the US actually step up if we attack Taiwan? Well, we can test that hypothesis. And I think we've just accelerated, we've certainly massively increased risks to war and regional instability in the Indo-Pacific theater. To counter some of that, I mean, Canada's ability is limited, but as you point out, here's an opportunity to send a clear signal. With the inability for us to actually get our act together and make a decision on Huawei. Now, you could argue that Do we need to make a decision? The three telcos have gotten the message. It's risky for business and for there's significant reputational risk if you go with Huawei equipment. So they've signaled they're going to go with Ericsson. So, you can say from a government perspective, mission accomplished. But really, I think what we do need is a public statement and a public commitment. And this is sort of what I meant before when I talked about the intelligence relationship with the United States and with our allies. That if our other key three allies in this area, the United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States, take a clear stance, but we look again once again like the weak link in this. We expect other countries to step up for us when it comes to the two Michaels, but then we're not willing to oblige when other countries are telling us we need a hard line on this, we need a clear signal. And you talk to anybody who understands the technology, having your adversaries' switches in your internet infrastructure and in your wireless towers to be able to throttle traffic, manipulate traffic, reroute traffic, exfiltrate traffic, decode that traffic, or possibly stop that traffic altogether, when data is the most valuable commodity of the 21st century, is simply from a strategic perspective not acceptable. And so that we take sort of these, we balance a few perhaps Canadian business interests and we're willing to risk Canadian lives simply because we don't want to take a clear, hard stance on Huawei and stand with our allies. I think it's bad strategy, but it's also bad signaling in terms of our commitment to stand together at times when clearly the US is facing a peer challenger in terms of resources, where the way forward for the US is to know that they too can count on their allies.
Yeah, you talked about you wish leaders would take advice with President Biden listening, that you would only do the rational thing, which is take the people out first before the machinery. But our director of CSIS here in Canada has also stated, and it doesn't often happen, but declared that China is a direct threat to our national security and our national sovereignty. So when the director of CSIS says that, one would think that we might take a second look at handing over the keys to our embassies and consulates to what is clearly a hostile power.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting shift, because it is really the first time since the Sidewinder investigation wound down in 1997 that CSIS has made any sort of public stance and declaration on China, and that CSIS also now finally feels licensed to be able, clearly with that statement, to go after Chinese interference and Chinese espionage efforts in Canada, and to deter that, hopefully to engage more in deterring that elsewhere. So I think it's a significant shift. And let's remember, of course, the Sidewinder investigation was wound down precisely because a Liberal government made it clear to CSIS that there was not going to be an investigation into the way Chinese interests were acting in Canada in the 1990s. And so I think we've had a very long shadow from that Sidewinder decision. This is all public knowledge. The audience can look this up.
That's a great bit of context. Absolutely.
So I think the statements are quite significant by the CSIS director. Presumably, he would have not been able, David Vigneault would have not been able to make those statements if he hadn't coordinated that previously with the political leadership. So there must have been some element of license here. The question is, was that element of license as a signaling in terms of public opinion, seeing the shift of public opinion and sort of pandering to public opinion by the government and trying to pander to sort of our allies to say we're going to
carry on with business as usual behind closed doors?
Right. Or are we actually going to walk the walk here and actually follow up and not just use CSIS as sort of a public ploy and a public instrument to try to appease the public opinion and appease our allies? We need to follow this up with concrete action.
Okay, I want to ask you about a couple of things, but I can't let the decisions surrounding the virus, around COVID, around what was going on at the Wuhan lab. We are now seeing all of this come out from appropriate and legitimate news sources. These can't be dismissed as conspiracy theories anymore. The reports this week that the Chinese were reacting to a viral threat as early as the summer of 2019. We know how they delayed in terms of telling the rest of the world. We knew that they did not deliver on their promises of supplies and vaccines and all of that. And eventually what we have done, while not saying anything about that at all, is we quietly took 2 scientists out of a lab in Winnipeg and sent them home. And then the government went to court to say, nobody can, we're hiding the documents. We're not going to tell you what we think or what went down. In most other countries, this would have been a front page story for months.
So my conjecture of what likely went on here is we now know, both from the open source intelligence that's available, and I think, this is why the government really doesn't want these documents released, is the Wuhan lab is a level 2 lab. Yeah. But they were conducting level 4 type of activity. So they did not have the protocols in place, and they did not have the safeties in place to do the work that they were actually doing. And what the 2 individuals from the National Microbiology Lab were doing were effectively enabling level 4 type work at a level 2 facility. And the supervisors at the National Microbiology Lab should have caught on to that. So even if, which I doubt, but even if all the interactions between those 2 labs and with the individuals were completely above board, management completely failed on making sure that Canadian collaboration doesn't enable an adversarial country that is actively working on a bioweapons program, and making sure that we only, we wouldn't have, for instance, I don't know, say high-tech collaboration or other types of dangerous sort of, say, collaboration with countries where we know they don't have proper safety protocols in place. We make sure in our universities you have to have proper safety protocols in place. And yet here we freely shared to enable work that should never have been done at this facility in the first place. So for me, it is not a surprise that something went wrong in that facility. And I think it's got to remind us that the way China plays is it throws out all the rules. It'll just do whatever they think sort of should be done under whatever sort of conditions. And if that endangers the public health of Chinese citizens, who of course were the first people to suffer under this, now it's enabled the Chinese regime to double down on authoritarianism under the guise of the virus, and of course then cause a global pandemic calamity. I mean, this reinforces the fact that China cannot be trusted. China is an irresponsible international player. It won't behave by proper international norms, even when dealing with some of the most dangerous research that can possibly ever be conducted in the world. We see the consequences of that research, and yet Canada is quite happy to basically let China walk away from this instead of pressing harder. And I think we need to do more. And look, we can change the past, but we need to position ourselves in a more sustainable fashion for the future. We need to make sure we have a proper intelligence early warning network, and we need to posture ourselves, because given what came out of China, I can assure you there are other global challenges that will have major ramifications for our public health, for our security, for our economy coming out of China in the coming years that we won't necessarily be able to anticipate. But what we need to learn is we can't suffer the sort of human, economic, political disruption that this virus has brought again. And what are we doing to position ourselves more sustainably? I have yet to hear anything from the federal government on this in terms of leadership.
But that is the point. I mean, they have brought the Western world to its knees economically. We'll be dealing with the consequences of this in our society for decades to come. We're watching what inflation is doing these days because of the money printed to try and solve this. Thousands upon thousands of deaths. Just the impact is so enormous, it's hard for us to see it when you're in the middle of it. And we don't have even a critical word about China, because of course that would be deemed racist, and we can't say that. I mean, there are some things that are just so self-evident to Canadian citizens who walk down the street, and our government doesn't reflect it in even the quietest way.
So I think there's an important takeaway here. So anybody who really understands the World Health Organization knows that the World Health Organization has been captive to China since the 1950s. So this is not a new phenomenon. So we should have known that whatever comes out of the World Health Organization can't be trusted. So when we have ministers of the government saying, oh, we're just taking the advice from the World Health Organization, the early days of the pandemic, from an organization that we know is captive to China, clearly either the government is getting bad advice or it's not taking the advice that it is getting. And I think in many cases, it is the latter. And we've seen this since the 1990s. We've seen a political class, not just in Canada, but across Western democracies, that increasingly are not taking the advice that they're getting, that are making political decisions against the best advice of their own experts, as well as of outside experts. And look at what it's gotten us. I think it has, I am not surprised that there is a growing number of citizens in democracies who are disenchanted with what their governments have brought to them over the last 25 years. And I do really lay blame at the political elite and at the political class for significant failures of the last 25 years. I am not surprised that we, during the pandemic, are able to, that our adversaries are doubling down on undermining the performative legitimacy of democratic institutions, because we ourselves have laid the groundwork over the last 25 years for them to be able to do that. And I think the lesson here is the political class actually needs to deliver for their citizens, and it needs to have some foresight in terms of strategy of the consequences that are going to arise from key decisions that the political class is going to make. You know, and I think Afghanistan, Iraq, those are other examples of where we're clearly made decisions that were not in the long-term interests of arguably the local region or of our own taxpayers, our own citizens, or our own security. So I think there's tough questions to ask here. I think we live in a very complex world, and for politicians who constantly want to simplify things and just sell the electorate simple solutions to complex problems that also tend to be wrong, we really need to change the way we do business, or we're going to be further undermining the trust that our citizens have in our democracies.
What kind of response do you think it would take to change those attitudes? We do have the political class making decisions that suit their political purpose. As you say, President Biden wanting to make an announcement on the 20th anniversary of 9/11 because of the symbolism of it, the virtue signaling that goes on. An election in Canada called on the day that Kabul falls. We've talked about this in other contexts about you can shame a corporation if you go on Twitter and say its product is lousy into making some changes. They're way more responsive to their customers and their advertisers. How do we send that message to our political leaders that they have to do more? The election's a very blunt instrument to try and send those kinds of messages.
I think to some extent, I lay the blame at our electorates. We live in a democracy, and so it's ultimately up to the people to set the standards. And I think on the one hand, the people have not set particularly high standards. And on the other hand, they've been snowed by the political class. Look, the hard conversations
and the media reporting it, the media reporting of the political class, yeah.
That I think so part of the challenge is, for instance, we all know that foreign policy effectively played no role in our election, and it didn't play any role in the German election, that generally elections aren't won on foreign policy. And politicians know that. Yet, of course, the biggest challenge that we face to Canadian democracy, prosperity, security are not decisions that we're making domestically. It is decisions that we're making internationally, and how we position ourselves with our allies and partners in terms of the challenges in a globalized world that emanate from state and non-state bad actors. And so I think but politicians know that that's a hard conversation to have with the public. So I think they don't want to go there because they don't want to have hard conversations. It's easier to have a conversation about, well, are we going to put 5 billion more into the healthcare system, or are we going to put 10 billion more into the healthcare system? Because that's simply about writing a check. It doesn't require a strategy. It doesn't require a concept of where we actually want to be. And I think one of the interesting countries to watch are countries that actually take the security threats to themselves and to their region seriously. And that's where I want to bring up Australia again. A small country living in a dangerous neighborhood, they can afford to put their head in the sand and sort of pretend everything's going to be all peasy and we're somehow going to muddle through and get through this. They have a very clear understanding, having been let down and almost invaded in the world wars, that when it comes down to it, on the one hand, they're on their own, and on the other hand, they need to have a clear stance and a clear strategy of how to make sure they never find themselves in a situation like the Battle of the Coral Sea ever again in Australian history. And I think what we're missing in Canada is we put our head in the sand. We pretend we're, the fireproof house, Senator Dandurand, your late colleague, and we pretend we're thousands of kilometers away from the troubles of the world. And when in doubt, our allies or the Americans are going to bail us out, which is essentially what happened sort of in the Meng situation. We trusted that sooner or later the Americans were going to bail us out. So the classic sort of Canadian recipe. And, I think the lessons from what's transpired during the Trump administration, and I would really say the trajectory over the last 20 or so years in the United States, is that we don't want to count overly on the United States. Sure, we want to hope we can count on the United States, but we actually need to have a foreign policy that understands that either the United States' interests are going to diverge from our own, or the United States is going to be too busy with other priorities to worry about a small ally like Canada and whatever idiosyncrasies that we might want to bring to the table. So where's our ability to formulate a robust foreign policy that actually deals with the world as it is, rather than as Canadians and Canadian politicians wish it were?
But that's my point. They get away with not doing that. Nobody throws them out of office or puts them into office based on those large fundamental questions, as your book title says, intelligence is as democratic statecraft, using the information we all have access to make smart decisions, playing our part internationally, stepping up, having the equipment we need to do that, reacting when there's bad behavior by large players. It's not for lack of information about that. It's lack of will. And then they are neither rewarded or punished if they do or do not do something on the international stage. Why take the risk?
So I think we need to reverse the way we're thinking about this problem in Ottawa. We're currently starting with values, and then we derive our other policy positions from values, rather than understanding where it all starts is with security. Why is Canada one of the most popular countries in the world for anybody to migrate to? Because we're a secure country. We have a predictable system, and we're able to provide prosperity. We're able to provide democracy and the rule of law, and values. That is to say, the rule of law and the way we're able to assert it follows from the ability to live in a secure, prosperous, and democratic environment. And what we've effectively done in the current policy discourse is turn this around, when we somehow believe that somehow from values is going to spring democracy, prosperity, and security. And so if we actually understand that we've got the causal vector the exactly wrong way around, that might be a good start even for us to start formulating a public conversation, because I don't think we can come up with a sensible, workable, cohesive strategy of what is it that we want to achieve and how are we going to achieve it if we start with the wrong first principles.
Okay, we'll just end on this one, Christian. And I mean, there's, is the horse out of the barn? I mean, how do we get back to that position when we are where we are? The Chinese have flights over Taiwan. Any politician that wants to talk about Taiwan versus China and whether we should take a position on that, we won't even do something that simple in this country.
So the question is, what can Canada sensibly achieve,
Correct.
Especially in the Indo-Pacific? And I think there's a couple of approaches to this. One is that as a country alone, we're not really a noticeable player in the Indo-Pacific. But while Canada may not be conspicuous by its presence, it sure is conspicuous by its absence. So actually showing the Canadian flag, actually showing up for meetings, actually showing that we profoundly care about the region and that we understand much of the future of the world is being sorted out in that region right here, right now. That I think might be a good start. At the same time, recognizing that we're never going to be a major player in that particular theater, and that there's other allies and partners that we just need to draft behind and support and show the flag. We need to focus on the areas that are going to be critical for us and our interests, which I think is Canada's North and the Arctic, because we need to pitch in on continental defense. And look, we are still 5 years later trying to figure out what NORAD renewal looks like. We actually need to get down to business when our adversaries are building hypersonic weapons and unmanned undersea vehicles that we cannot detect and we cannot intervene with the capabilities that we currently have. That requires a complete rethink of how we do data and communications in the Canadian Armed Forces, for instance. So having that conversation and making sure that our European allies know that we are there for them, because our second most important strategic relationship after the United States is Europe, both to balance the United States and because we've learned through a very hard lessons in the 20th century that territorial integrity, the harmony, prosperity, democracy of Europe and the European continent is integral and vital to Canada's strategic interests. And so we need to make sure that we double down. And that means, on the one hand, being present and being able to commit, which is hard to do when your equipment is rusting out and when you're not able to be the employer of choice for the Canadian Armed Forces. So this is why we need to double down on making sure that the largest employer, single organizational employer in this country, is the employer of choice for all Canadians and sets the gold standard. We need to make sure we actually spend the money that is necessary. Having ships roll off dock in 2038 is simply not acceptable when we are possibly facing serious challenges from our adversaries in a matter of 5 to 7 years. And it also means that we need to double down in our broader abilities to also push our allies in Europe to be able to have that deterrence and that capability and commitment. I think there are serious challenges coming, for instance, out of the major player in continental Europe, such as Germany. So we need to show that we're willing to do our part, provided other players are willing to do their part. Many of our allies have done so after the Wales summit in terms of their commitment, at least to more spending, at least to a reinvestment. And I think it is embarrassing when an ally such as Poland is able to get their act together and buy F-35s and a host of modern equipment, while we are still dithering in this country a dozen years later. The F-35 is the only fighter jet that can actually fly through Russian air defenses through the entire European periphery. That is real deterrence, and that's demonstrating to our adversaries that we are here and we are committed. So let's actually get down to business. It's not that hard. We know where the answers lie. And if we can spend billions on the pandemic, then presumably we can find a little bit of money, because a little bit of deterrence and security on the front end, as in, look, defense is an insurance investment, so we don't end up with the sort of conflicts that we saw in the 20th century. That's the investment we made after the Second World War. That's the lessons we learned from the economic, the human, the political dislocations of the First and Second World War, of the interwar period, of the Holocaust. Why is it that we've forgotten those lessons, that we need to make that investment in our assurance? The premium that we're paying is simply not enough, not in financial costs and not in political commitment.
So great to hear your thoughts on that. And I'm very appreciative that there are people like you who are trying to put the pieces together for everybody to understand. It's there, it's obvious. Your new book, Intelligence is Democratic Statecraft, and I introduced you at the beginning. The list is long. At the School of Policy Studies, Director of the Institute of Government Relations, Senior Fellow at Macdonald-Laurier, a Professor in Leadership, and that is exactly what you're showing us today. Thank you, Christian Leuprecht, for the insights, for the work you do, and I hope we'll talk again soon.
Thank you for your commitment to this file and for the opportunity to talk. Thank you.
Thanks. That is it for No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin for today. We'll talk soon.